Our world, it feels like it's pulling apart at the seams, right? Well, the United Nations is putting forward a pretty bold proposal to try and stitch it back together. It's called the Pact for the Future. You can think of it as a global game plan, one designed to tackle everything from war and climate chaos to the ethics of AI and even the way our world is governed. So, how are we going to break this down? We're going to look at it through three big pillars. First, we'll see how the pact plans to confront the major threats to global peace and security. Then, we'll explore how it aims to grab hold of technology and use it for progress. And finally, we'll get into its really ambitious ideas for shaking up and reforming the world's governing institutions. Okay, let's start with the most fundamental thing there is: keeping people safe. The pact takes a pretty serious and frankly cautionary tone here. It argues that the old ways of trying to keep the peace just aren't cutting it anymore, and it lays out a new plan to build a much more stable foundation for all of us. So that's the big question, isn't it? How do we actually do that? The pact's answer is surprisingly simple, but also really powerful. Everybody needs to go back to the rulebook. It's a call for every single nation to recommit to the fundamental principles of international law that, let's be honest, they've already agreed to. And you can see this isn't about inventing some complicated new system. It's about getting serious and doubling down on the absolute basics. Protecting civilians who are caught in conflict, choosing diplomacy instead of violence, actually respecting the decisions of the world's highest court, and following through on disarmament treaties. Now here's a really crucial insight that the pact hammers home. Peace just plain doesn't work if you leave half the population out of the conversation. It makes this powerful case that any peace process is basically set up to fail without the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women and young people. It's calling for real action to get them a seat at the table. Of course, this strategy isn't just about traditional conflicts. It's also about adapting to the threats we face right now. That means things like retooling peacekeeping missions for today's complex world, tackling security threats on the high seas, and getting much tougher on the fight against terrorism and the organized crime that so often funds it. And all of these commitments, they build towards one huge and very sobering goal. The pact doesn't mince words here. It calls for a firm recommitment to the total elimination of nuclear weapons, not as some distant dream, but as something that's absolutely necessary for our survival. All right, so after tackling some pretty heavy threats, the pact makes a big pivot toward opportunity. It asks a really hopeful question. What are the most powerful tools we have to actually build a better world? And the answer, presented with a real sense of optimism, is all about science, technology, and innovation. But here's the thing. The main goal is to make sure technology is a bridge, not another wall dividing the world. So the pact lays out a clear three-step strategy. First, share knowledge and technical know-how. Second, get more funding for local scientific research in developing countries. And third, build strong global partnerships to make it all happen. And just like we saw in the peace and security section, this idea of inclusivity is a huge deal here too. The pact is crystal clear. Any technological progress has to be a force for gender equality. It has to actively work to close that digital divide and empower women and girls everywhere. And this is really interesting. The pact recognizes that progress isn't just about the latest shiny gadget. It calls for a balance, a synergy between cutting-edge science and the deep traditional knowledge held by indigenous and local communities. The argument is that we need the wisdom of both to truly move forward. Okay, so we've talked about the major problems and the tools we can use to fix them. But, none of that matters much if the system itself, the global architecture, is broken. This final section really gets into the nitty-gritty of reforming our global institutions so they're actually fit for the 21st century. And this is the central question driving all these proposed reforms. The pact doesn't pull any punches here. It basically says that many of our big international institutions were built for a post-World War II world, and now they're just buckling under the weight of today's interconnected crises. So what's the biggest target for reform? Well, it's the UN Security Council. The pact argues it's basically stuck in the past, and the proposed changes are pretty fundamental. Address the historic injustice of Africa having so little representation, give a bigger voice to Asia and Latin America, and finally, do something about the paralyzing power of the veto. But it's not just about the Security Council. The plan also calls for breathing new life into the General Assembly. That's the one UN body where every single country gets an equal vote, to give it more clout when it comes to tackling global problems. Okay, now for what might be the most ambitious part of this whole thing. We're talking a deep dive into reforming the entire international financial system, the whole web of institutions that basically governs the global economy. The argument is that it's outdated and needs to be made way more fair and responsive to what's happening now. And the goals for this big financial overhaul are super clear. 1. Unlock more money for sustainable development. 2. Make sure countries can borrow for the long term without getting crushed by debt. 3. Build a stronger safety net for developing countries during global shocks. And 4. Funnel some serious cash into fighting climate change. And if you had to boil all of these financial reforms down to one single crucial idea, it would be this: giving developing countries a much stronger voice and more real representation in the institutions whose decisions literally shape their economic futures. So, at the end of the day, what we have here is an incredibly ambitious roadmap filled with promises. It lays out this vision for a world that's safer, more equitable, and more sustainable. But its success really hangs on one final question. Will the nations of the world actually find the collective will to turn all these promises into action?